When a child, after his father drops him from his arms and lets him fall to the ground, whispers in his ear, "Trust no one, don't even trust me," how can he learn to believe his words? This question contains the cipher of John D. Rockefeller's entire life, because that child became a man who changed the world, but first had to reconcile two opposing forces within him: his father's wild courage and his mother's iron discipline. On this journey stretching from Moravia to Owego, the Rockefeller family didn't merely change location. They were being tested in the most merciless laboratory of the American dream. And little John, unaware, was practically inscribing into his DNA the codes needed to become one of capitalism's greatest architects. Now listen, because in this story you will see the hidden patterns in your own life. When they moved from Richford to Moravia, the Rockefellers hadn't just gone 30 miles north. They had made a leap from a backward frontier settlement toward a more sedate community, with proper wooden houses in the town center. And this leap was creating a frequency shift in little John's consciousness. Moravia, founded by the United Brethren in Christ, had long since become a fortress of prohibition and anti-slavery. It had a hotel, a grocery store, a cotton factory, and a Congregationalist church, but that wasn't really the point. This town was creating an energy field, and this field was setting into motion the hidden talents within John with a magnetic pull. Even today, Moravia stands as an authentic piece of Americana, with its elegant shaded streets and houses, with wide friendly verandas. But you must see the truth behind this romantic image. This town was like a mirror that kept a child's secret within it, while simultaneously shaping him. The Rockefellers lived in the rural suburbs north of town, and around 1843. Bill paid a $1,000 deposit for a grassy highland gently sloping toward Owasco Lake. This lake was one of the most picturesque of the Finger Lakes, and Bill expanded the existing house, transforming it into a structure of 7 or 8 rooms, surrounded by tall pines, with magnificent views overlooking the bright blue lake. For John D., this 2-story wooden house was a magical stage and became permanent as an emblem of pastoral beauty because he loved catching yellow perch from the cold, clear lake in summer months, and even winters enchanted him, despite the merciless cold. In an unplastered upper-floor room, snowstorms and sharp winter winds seeped through cracks in the walls to where the children slept, heated only by a stovepipe rising from the furnace. But all these hardships were building a lasting sense of resilience within John. How the wind roared among the poplars on the lake shore, Rockefeller recalled dreamily in his late 70s, and this recollection wasn't merely nostalgia. It was the first vibrations of the frequency of endurance within him. In the darkness before dawn, the children often woke to the sharp axe sounds of woodcutters or the creaking of sleds sliding over hard snow. Eliza would stand at the bottom of the stairs, calling to her eldest son, "Come on, son, get up, time to milk your cow." In the dim, cold barn, John always stood on the steaming earth, freshly emptied by the cow he was milking to warm his feet, because he had already cracked the code of turning discomfort into opportunity at a young age. The first 3 Rockefeller children, Lucy, John, and William, had been born in Richford. But by 1843, while Big Bill was again on journeys lasting months, Eliza gave birth to a second girl, Mary Ann, and 2 years later, twins were born. The boy Frank was healthy, but Frances was sickly from birth and received about 70 visits from a local doctor, before dying just before her second birthday. And Eliza tried to protect 7-year-old John D. from this first predatory brush with death, but it was seared into his memory. In his elderly years, when he visited Moravia in his 80s, he pointed to a field and related this. "When Francis was being buried, they sent me to that field to gather stones so I wouldn't know. This experience left within him an unnamed fear of death, and probably Eliza was the first to notice this. In Moravia, William Avery Rockefeller behaved like a strange mixture of a solid citizen and an attractive rogue, and as in Richford, townspeople watched him pass by on fast horses, adorned in fancy clothes, and his lavish spending sometimes created the impression that he was the town's richest man. Mary Ann, later rejecting exaggerated stories about childhood poverty, said this: "We never lacked in terms of food and clothing. We had every kind of reasonable comfort. We weren't rich, of course, far from it, but we always had food and things to use and save." Moravia was the golden period of John's childhood because his father briefly desired nobility, and a neighbor even labeled Bill the most notable man in the community. The region was rich in virgin pine forests. Therefore, Bill established a legal and quite profitable logging operation, and before dawn, finding direction only by starlight and lanterns, he descended the logs to the lakeshore with his teams on sleds, then floated them to Auburn at the north end of the lake. With a sudden civil spirit outburst, Bill helped select the location of the town school, counting the rotations of carriage wheels passing through town, then placing the school right in the center of the community. He convinced local taxpayers to pay for this at a time when many people still thought families should educate their children at home. With an entrepreneurial vision that would also be passed to his son, Bill not only found new resources, he enriched Owasco Lake with pike and even took on the chairmanship of the local prohibition committee. "That's the kind of man he was," John D. boasted. While his neighbors were starting to talk about something, he would have gotten something done. The Moravia period revealed an important truth about Bill. He had a fundamental desire for respectability and probably didn't plan to spend his entire life as a traveling charlatan preying on naive people, but right here there's a paradox you must also see. Bill never deigned to dirty his hands in agricultural work, because he saw this as a pursuit unworthy of his honor. He hired a railroad worker named Hiram Odell to work the farm and look after his family during the excursions he still frequently made, and Bill gave him this instruction: "Their mother isn't strong enough to direct them. They need some discipline. Do what you think is right for them." While Odell tilled and harvested the garden in his spare time, Eliza gave the children tasks, and one day, pulling a rope along the garden, she said to her two eldest sons, "John, you hold this side of the rope. Will, this side is yours," she said. This simple but effective leadership lesson was etched into John's mind. Contrary to his father's contempt for manual labor, John, who always saw himself as a son of ordinary people, enjoyed the hardships of rural life and began to believe that these hardships hardened him for later industrial struggle. His frugally spent childhood further strengthened his already stoic character and made him resilient against future difficulties. He was now at the center of a magnetic field, and this field was setting into motion all the hidden forces within him. In 1840s America, there was enough economic activity to excite any future boss's fantasy. Banks were beginning to sprout everywhere. Canals were cutting through the countryside. Steamships were navigating the rivers. Railroads and telegraphs were connecting the first national markets, and the expansion of lands was practically in the air. Texas was annexed in 1845, and war with Mexico seemed inevitable. Though only vaguely aware of such distant developments, John D. Rockefeller was already like a perfect example of Homo economicus. Even as a child, he would buy candy by weight, divide it into small pieces, and then sell it to his siblings at a considerable profit. By the time he reached 7 years old, with his mother's encouragement, He was accumulating the gold, silver, and copper coins he earned in a blue porcelain bowl on the mantelpiece. John's first business coup came at age 7. He shadowed a turkey hen going to the forest, raided its nest, and raised the chicks to sell. Eliza, to support his enterprise, gave him milk whey to feed the turkeys, and enabled him to raise an even larger brood the following year. As an old man, Rockefeller said, "To this day I love to see a flock of turkeys and never miss the opportunity to examine them. But now pay attention, because there's a critical point here." However rosy Rockefeller's memories may be, early period photographs tell a much more somber story. His face was grim and dull, lacking childish joy and liveliness, his skin tight, his eyes appearing empty and lightless. To other people he generally appeared distracted, and they remembered him walking on rural roads with a dull face, absorbed in thoughts, as if solving deep problems. "He was a quiet child," said a Moravia resident. "He seemed to be constantly thinking." And in many ways John was forgettable, hard to distinguish from many other children. Later, when he astonished the world, many old neighbors and classmates struggled to summon even a blurry image of him. He was a slow-learning student, but patient and persevering, and like J.P. Morgan and Jay Gould, he displayed extraordinary mental ability in mathematics. "I wasn't an easy student, and I had to apply myself with effort to prepare my lessons," said Rockefeller, and accurately described himself as reliable, but not brilliant. For 30 weeks of the year, since rural children had to take leave for farm work, he attended the single classroom school his father established. It was a plain white structure with a sloping roof and dark shuttered windows. Discipline was harsh and precise. When students misbehaved, the teacher menacingly held a slate over their heads, but if Rockefeller didn't excel in class, part of this might have stemmed from lacking a brilliant child's exhibitionism, yearning for gold stars. He was always introverted and didn't much care about others' approval. Thus was free from a certain childish vanity, and this freedom was creating a unique frequency within him. Looking back, it seems truly extraordinary how this cool-headed child clarified his goals and followed them with determination, without succumbing to any childish impulsiveness. He showed extraordinary caution when playing checkers or chess, examined each move at length, solved every possible counter-move in his head. "I'll move when I understand," he would respond to opponents trying to rush him. "Do you think I'm playing to lose?" To ensure victory, he submitted only to games where he could dictate the rules. Despite his slow and sedate manner, he had the ability to make quick decisions after thoroughly weighing his action plan. This ability formed the foundation of all the decisions he would make at Standard Oil. Despite being generally serious and devoting most of his time to books, music, and church, he had a sly wit, the kind that twisted unexpectedly at the edges of a sentence. In his sister-in-law's words, he had a quick sense of humor, but his mirth was always measured and sedate. His appreciation was sharp, but I don't remember him laughing loudly. But I remember his eyes flashing quickly and the dimples appearing on his cheek when he heard or saw something funny. Sister Mary Ann remembered him as a stubborn joker. "He would always make jokes with a serious face, surprising us like this." Rockefeller actually had a strong sense of humor, but this generally remained hidden behind a veil of seriousness. And now right here, there's a deep truth you must also understand. John D. Rockefeller turned to church not as a burden or unpleasant duty, but as a refuge that deeply refreshed his soul, because his childhood Baptist church harbored many clues about the secrets of his character. As a young man, he was raised on a constant diet of maxims based on evangelical Protestantism that guided his behavior. Many of his Puritan attitudes might seem old-fashioned to later generations, but these were the religious patterns of his childhood. Indeed, the saga of his monumental business achievements cannot be separated from the fire and brimstone atmosphere that enveloped northern New York in his childhood, because even his father, though inclined to flirt with the devil's companionship, knew many hymns by heart and encouraged his children to go to church, once offering John $5 to read the Bible from beginning to end, thus establishing early and unconsciously a connection between God and money. Always an iconoclastic, rogue spirit, Bill never actually joined a church. That would be going too far. So John identified religion with his beloved mother Eliza. Eliza found balm for her soul's troubles in the Bible. John attended a Sunday school a short distance from their house on the hill and remembered his teacher as someone who was once a blasphemer, but later repented and became a serious Christian. The child saw religion not as a system of otherworldly rewards, but as a tool for moral reform on earth. With Bill often away, Eliza convinced a Presbyterian neighbor to take her and the children to Baptist church on Sunday mornings. The family would sit side by side in the same pew, and Eliza would encourage the children to leave pennies in the donation plate. Rockefeller later cited his mother's selflessness as the origin of his philanthropy. Early in his life, he learned that God expected his servants to first make money, then donate this money in a never-ending cycle. "From the beginning, I was trained to work and save," Rockefeller explained. "It has always seemed to me a religious duty to take everything I could honestly get and give everything I could give. As a child, I was taught this way by the preacher, and low church Baptists allowed wealth accumulation but opposed arrogant, ostentatious display. And this created a tension that would continue throughout Rockefeller's life." Though the First Baptist Church was founded by Roger Williams in Rhode Island in 1639, the denomination couldn't gain its real momentum until the so-called Great Awakening that began around 1739. This increase in religious fervor gained strength following the East Coast tour of charismatic English Methodist evangelist George Whitefield. And in open fields, amidst much crying, screaming, fainting, and writhing guiltily on the ground, masses were converted to Christianity, or their wavering faiths were restored. This effusive emotional period triggered extraordinary growth among Baptists. They placed great importance on voluntary baptism and believers openly proclaiming their faith. Over 100 new Baptist churches emerged in New England alone, and with non-professional leaders and autonomous congregations, Baptists were ideally suited to the frontier regions and the democratic spirit of colonists. Often emerging from among ordinary people, usually unpaid and inadequately educated, Baptist preachers set out toward the interior regions where other clergymen hesitated to go. Because they were against religious establishments and owed no allegiance to supervisory bishops or a central church hierarchy, they could establish a church in any creek or hollow, and by the end of the 18th century were emerging as a major religious force. The Second Great Awakening elevated New England and the mid-Atlantic states to a new curtain of religious fire from 1800 to the late 1830s, and this long-lasting movement peaked around 1830. Then revival fires burned so hot that Rochester and other parts of northeastern New York and Ohio were called the Burned Over District. When revivalists, most famous among them Charles Grandison Finney, came to a town, they often organized prayer meetings lasting through the nights. These theatrical scenes, marked by dramatic emotional outbursts, featured hardened sinners who were openly called to repentance by townspeople and seated on the anxious bench. When they saw the light, the guilty parties generally dissolved into tears and prayed on their knees. Preachers tried to reach people with vivid calls, appealing to hope and fear, depicting the joys of heaven and flaming lakes of hell. Famous preacher Jacob Knapp of the period portrayed tormented sinners as figures climbing to the edges of fiery pits, with demons sadistically pushing them back into the flames with spiked forks. The revival movement was self-sustaining because the saved were expected to rescue others from Satan's clutches. Going door to door, they tried to pull sinners from their homes until the entire town was gripped by passionate and nearly hysterical emotion. These aspects of the revival movement are especially notable because they will echo very prominently in Rockefeller's life. In the late 1820s, militant evangelists in Rochester agitated against smoking, dancing, playing cards, billiards, and theater, while also boycotting stores open on the Sabbath. As Rockefeller said, "When I go back to my early business days and childhood, the Baptists I knew lived according to their conscience and religious teachings. They didn't dance anywhere, not just in public places, and wouldn't even acknowledge the respectability of dancing. The theater was viewed by conscientious Christians as a source of immorality to be avoided. Because liquor was considered a demonic brew, a believer could not make it, sell it, or serve it to guests, and a temperance vow became a standard component of accepting Jesus into one's life." In childhood, Rockefeller permanently internalized the feeling that a believing Christian must stand like an armed soldier against all worldly temptations and never break from the divine orbit. This feeling also created a constant vibration within him. Departing from strict Calvinism, Baptist evangelists clung to the egalitarian view that not just a small predetermined elect but all wayward souls could be saved, and they actively engaged in evangelism and missionary work. Rockefeller was raised believing that no one was irreversibly lost and that people were free individuals who could be saved by their will. A self-reliant perspective that shaped his conservative political views. Baptist upbringing also made him prone to embrace the concept of constant self-improvement that was extremely influential in 19th century American culture. For example, Finney was a Presbyterian who advised his listeners to pursue perfection in their worldly lives and now pay attention, because Rockefeller entered the Baptist Church at a fateful moment. In May 1845, due to the issue of missionary slave owners, a split occurred and Baptist delegates from 9 southern states separated from the national structure to establish the Southern Baptist Convention. Northern Baptists fervently believed that anti-slavery was consistent with their opposition to religious hierarchy, their populist spirit, and their broad-based campaigns to cleanse sin from society. The Second Great Awakening triggered political activism by directly linking personal transformation with social reform. Though colonists had consumed devil's rum abundantly in the colonial period, the new evangelical understanding's emphasis on social uplift contributed to the birth of a national prohibition movement in the 1820s and 1830s. For Rockefeller, an apolitical man, the church narrowed his social life but broadened his vision, provided a bridge to wider social concerns, and ultimately prepared him for the world of philanthropy, because now he was at the center of a magnetic field. If John Dee remembered his childhood as a simple homemade tableau as if from Currier and Ives' prints despite Devil Bill's flamboyant mischief, this was largely thanks to the balancing influence of Eliza and the church. Hardship set into motion a deep reserve of strength and wisdom in a simple village woman with a sparse face, quiet manner, and steady blue-gray eyes. "Mother was wonderful," said Mary Ann. "She ran the family in the home, conducted everything with great ease. Though Eliza regularly read the Bible, The few letters that survive to the present day show an extremely primitive level of education. She misspelled even the most basic words. She wrote herd instead of heard, pleasant instead of pleasant, and bane instead of ben. John was a perfect master of spelling and grammar. Almost foreign to grammar, she wrote letters sometimes containing a single run-on sentence, but now it's hard not to be impressed by Eliza's quiet courage. Despite her husband's irregular and irresponsible life, Eliza steadily raised 5 children. Because when Bill was away, she could never know where he was, what he was doing, or when he would reappear. She had Hiram Odell, and her father lived right across Owasco Lake, but Eliza was usually alone at night with the children, in a town on the edge of a wild area. Leafing through her Bible and puffing her corncob pipe, she worried about stray thieves. One of Rockefeller's favorite stories reveals her cool-headed response to danger. Mother had caught a cough and was staying in her room so we wouldn't catch it. When she heard thieves trying to slip behind the house and remembered there was no man to protect us, she quietly cracked open the window and began humming an old Negro tune. As if the house was full, everyone was up. The robbers turned away from the house, crossed the road to the carriage, stole a set of harness, and descended the hill to get to their boat. And from these early experiences, John D. took a deep, lasting respect for women. Unlike other bosses of the Gilded Age, he never viewed them in purely decorative terms. Born in 1813, Eliza had grown up in the shadow of the Second Great Awakening and never showed slackness regarding discipline. While Devil Bill distributed gifts to the children, Eliza measured out punishment by default and tried to suppress the wild Rockefeller streak in her children. Spiritual twin John, when the birch rod came out, had accepted harsh rural justice when tied to the apple tree and laid out for Macduff. In these situations I made my protests. She heard sympathetically and sweetly acknowledged, but she still laid it on and explained that I had earned the punishment and had to have it. Rockefeller recalled. "I'm doing this with love," she would say. But often she went to extremes on the side of harshness. Once, while punishing John for misbehavior at school, he began defending his innocence. "Never mind," she interrupted. "Once we've started this whipping, it will definitely work for next time," she said. And Rockefeller recounted a memory from his adolescence that etched his mother's grim discipline into his mind. They were living in Owego then, and she had forbidden him from ice skating on the Susquehanna River, but the attraction of a moonlit night overpowered the better judgment of John and his brother William. As they glided quietly along the river, they heard the desperate screams of a young child who had broken through and fallen into the ice from within. Pushing a pole to the stray child, John and William pulled him from the water and saved his life. When they returned home, Eliza appreciated their courage and then immediately got down to work without delay. "We thought we would be left without punishment," said Rockefeller, "but Mother still gave us a good tanning. And now right here, there's a truth you must also see. While William and Frank carried their father's broad face and high forehead, John had inherited Eliza's narrow face, piercing gaze, and sharp chin. His personality also fit the Davison mold much more closely. He also had his mother's slow metabolism and the ability to comfortably carry a great load over long periods. Many neighbors confirm that calm Eliza never lost her temper, never raised her voice, never scolded anyone, a form of underestimated but unshakable authority that John inherited. From his mother he learned economy, order, frugality, and other bourgeois virtues that played a very large role in his success at Standard Oil. Eliza, who paid heavily for her hasty decision to marry Devil Bill, accustomed her children to think coolly before deciding. The advice, "We'll boil it down," that she frequently repeated became a principle John adopted throughout his entire business life. And now pay attention. For a woman like Eliza, with intense pride and deep religiosity, enduring her traveling husband's unexplainable absences must have been difficult. Therefore, she inevitably drew even closer to her eldest son, who seemed early matured and unusually wise, in whom she sensed qualities not yet visible in the world. Because she trusted him and gave him adult responsibilities, he matured rapidly and gained unusual confidence. He must have appreciated the pride he felt serving as a surrogate father and being so vital to the family's survival. His relationship with his siblings was more paternal than fraternal. He frequently guided them, gave instructions. As he said, "In my own case, I know I was greatly helped by the trust imposed on me from early childhood." And of course, this childhood responsibility took a toll on John D. He experienced very little of youth's spontaneous joy or lightness. Growing up as a miniature adult loaded with duties led him to develop an exaggerated sense of responsibility that would become prominent throughout his life. He learned to see himself as a reluctant savior, taking responsibility for distressed situations that needed correction. And he worshipped his father until he began evaluating him with more mature eyes. William Avery Rockefeller, who could demonstrate achievements reminiscent of Paul Bunyan, embodied the audacity and manhood that every young child dreams of in a father. "I come from a strong family, men of unusual strength, a family of giants," Rockefeller said later in life. "What a brilliant smile my father had. Everyone loved him. They would call him Uncle Billy." And by all accounts, Bill was a man of abundant talents. He was such a superior athlete he could stand beside a fence and jump backward over it. Such an amazing ventriloquist he could create half a dozen characters speaking simultaneously. Such a legendary animal trainer he once taught tricks to a tame bear he won in a shooting contest. And such a skilled hypnotist that dark rumors circulated that he could bring down a mist on man and animal alike. And now pay attention. If the children identified Eliza with discipline, they identified Bill with laughter, abundance, and good times. He was an ideal hunting and fishing companion, a sharp marksman who could drop small birds in flight. Passionate about weapons, Bill kept a magnificent collection of rifles in his Moravia home, all clean and carefully oiled, including ones with telescopic sights. Standing in a meadow and aiming at a pine tree, he would fire rapid shots until it was shredded by shell bullets. His marksmanship served him extraordinarily well when selling patent medicines, because he skillfully used this skill to gather crowds in strange towns, setting up a clay pipe mannequin in his mouth, pulling back 200 paces, shattering the pipe, then offering a $10 banknote in the crowd to anyone who could match his skill in lively and entertaining. Bill created contagious joy wherever he went. As his son also noted, he always wanted things happening at home, song or some kind of music. And even when there was nothing around, he wouldn't fall short of cunning, using his talents to advance his own pleasure. One day he heard about a violin virtuoso locked in the town jail for drunkenness. The culprit was offered a choice: either pay a $100 fine or work 100 days in jail. For each passing day, $1 was deducted from his sentence. Unable to gather the $100, Bill let the musician stew for 35 days, then rescued him for $65 and took his violin in return. For decades, Bill greatly valued this rich-toned, concert-quality instrument, which he played like a country fiddler with the bow at waist level. His lasting love of music undoubtedly came from the Rockefeller branch of the family heritage that Rockefeller inherited. With Owasco Lake always gleaming from the window, many of John D.'s most beloved memories from Moravia centered on fishing with Bill. Bill was inclined to do crazy things in the boat. During one lake excursion, middle brother William, a plump little child who didn't know how to swim, made the mistake of complaining about the heat. "Then cool off," said his father, grabbing the astonished child by the waist and hurling him headfirst into the water. When William sank straight to the bottom, Big Bill jumped into the boat, pulled him back out, and then set about teaching him to swim. Looking on the bright side of the incident, John said, "He was always training us to meet responsibilities and look after ourselves. And it would be wrong to see William Avery Rockefeller as merely a cheerful, hedonistic spirit, though extremely attractive, because he was, in his own way, moral. He was a militant temperance advocate. Alcoholism had ruined his father, Godfrey. And when he caught John and William smoking in the barn, he harshly scolded them. After my brother reached 40 years of age, when my father learned he smoked, tears came to his eyes," said John. He loved to focus on his father's virtuous side, and this was a convenient way to easily overlook his flaws. In no area did Big Bill influence his eldest son as much as regarding money, or perhaps the eldest son was influenced by nothing this much, because Big Bill had an almost lustful passion for cash and took pleasure in ostentatiously displaying thick rolls of money. John D. Rockefeller inherited his cunning and love of money from his father, said one of Bill's friends. The old man had a passion for money equivalent to almost a madness. "I never encountered a man so passionate about money," said Bill. Reflecting the populist distrust toward banks that kept Standard Oil away from the clutches of small-town Wall Street financiers, he kept his money at home. As a neighbor recalled, he had money, lots of it. He kept it in a dresser drawer. I saw it there. Ones, twos, threes. We had $3 bills back then. Fives, tens, 20s, and 50s. All corded like wood and the bundles tied with string, stacks filling the drawer. And according to legend, he also had a 4-gallon bucket full of gold coins, but he probably hid base metal under the shiny surface. Once, during a family gathering, Bill disappeared for a while, then suddenly burst from his room with a patchwork tablecloth made of banknotes from different denominations. This was part of his obsessive need to project a grand image to hide the smallness of his achievements, and neither as a child nor as a man could John find anything pathological in his father's money madness, and he suggested he shared the same blind spot. After making his enormous fortune, he said admiringly about his father, "He was never accustomed to carrying less than $1,000, and he kept it in his pocket. He trusted himself and wasn't afraid to carry his money on him." The plague of John's childhood wasn't poverty, but chronic anxiety about money, and it's not hard to understand how cash began to seem like a blessed thing, God's abundance that softened all life's troubles. After the family spent anxious weeks or months making credit bills, waiting for their father's return, Bill would suddenly materialize, a cheerful Santa Claus swimming in wealth. He compensated for his long absences with shows of generosity he displayed to his children. For John, money was associated with these brief but enjoyable intervals when his capricious father was home and the Rockefellers functioned as a real family. And in the early Moravia years, Big Bill began educating his eldest son in business matters, sending him at 8 or 9 years old to evaluate and buy cordwood for the house. "I knew what good, hard oak and maple wood was," said Rockefeller. "My father instructed me to select only solid and proper boards, not to include knotty or rotten wood in it." Among all the lessons John absorbed from his father, perhaps none was more important than the importance of meticulous record-keeping. This was a necessity. Because Bill's arbitrary lifestyle forced his family to inflate their debts and closely monitor their generally fragile financial situation. And as for work ethic, Bill was the strangest composition. One moment extremely honorable, the next moment a complete charlatan. He conveyed to his son the message that trade was implicitly a harsh, competitive struggle, and you were justified in beating the other man by any method fair or foul. He trained John with a sharp and ruthless bargaining style. This is what made him famous. Bill, a most extraordinary bargainer, once offered $1,000 less than the owner wanted for a farm, suggested shooting at a target to settle matters. Bill won and got his $1,000 discount. As a traveling swindler while selling dubious treatments to naive rural folk, Bill had developed a pessimistic view about people's intelligence, and he didn't hesitate to exploit naive trust. As a boss, he had virtually patented his own peculiar, strange style of managing people. During his respectable time in the logging business, he paid his men well and promptly and was said by his son to be very popular. Yet, for a while he had a habit of hiring workers, politely telling them, "I don't need you anymore," then rehiring them a few days later, what he proudly called the fire and rehire policy. Though this made him seem like a less beloved boss, his son applauded this disturbing tactic. He kept the men constantly on alert. There was never any stagnation among them. Strangely, John described his father as most liberal and kind to his employees, but extremely practical, sharp, alert, and resourceful. And this was one of many areas where he didn't embellish the truth about Big Bill. The people he fired and rehired would describe Bill as liberal and kind, and John D. Rockefeller depicted his father as an exemplar of business virtue, though this was often an effort to cover the shadowy sides of Bill's life. There was an undeniable truth at hand. Bill paid his debts on time and clearly believed in the sanctity of contracts and took great effort to write them. As John also observed, he was extremely meticulous about fulfilling his contracts. He took special great care that everything was clearly understood and carefully written, that is, put in writing. And the training he gave me along these lines was very valuable, proven throughout my entire life. And in his business career, John D. Rockefeller was accused of many sins, but took pride in paying debts quickly and adhering strictly to contracts. Also reminiscent of his father, he was accused of confusing the legal with the honorable, of ignoring ethical subtleties, and whether John D. Rockefeller ultimately followed his father's unconscionable craft, or his mother's harsh respectability, is the question that most determines his historical reputation in guiding Standard Oil. Bertrand Russell once said about Rockefeller, "What he said, what he thought, and what he felt came from his mother, but what he did came from his father along with great caution created by early unpleasant situations." And the matter is much more complex than this, but there's no doubt that Rockefeller's success stemmed from the often tense interaction between two opposing, deeply rooted tendencies in his nature, his father's courage and his mother's caution, conditioned together under great pressure.